Okay, so anxiety is a big catch-all term, and there's a whole continuum and lots of nuances, and it can vary from just feeling mildly nervous or a little out of sorts to full-blown terror and everything in between. And it varies widely in intensity throughout our lives. It can be specific to something like a phobia where, I'm terrified of getting on an elevator because of closed spaces, or it can be what we call free floating, sort of generalized anxiety, where we don't really know the source of it or we can't really pinpoint it, and everything in between. So, but it's important to remember that we evolved as organisms, as creatures, to experience anxiety as a warning system in terms of dangers to our survival, to our aliveness. And survival really depended on anxiety for our ancient ancestors. They were constantly vigilant about threats. Threats, saber-toothed tigers, other tribes, starvation, lack of food. I mean, they had to be anxious to survive. And we haven't evolved beyond that, nor should we necessarily evolve beyond that. But we have less things to fear in our modern times, although there are still things. But what we tend to do now, our ancient ancestors were constantly vigilant for danger and threat. We tend to sort of imagine situations more than we face actual threatening situations. But I want to make the distinction between fear and anxiety. Fear tends to be in the moment. A truck is barreling down on me in the middle of the street. Someone is looking menacing if I'm walking down the street at night coming toward me. I mean, that's fear. It happens in the moment. Anxiety tends to be more future oriented. So we think about it in terms of the what ifs, what if this happens? What if the stock market crashes? What if my kids get sick? What if my dog gets run over? We're constantly what ifing with our anxiety. And it's important to distinguish between the two because fear is truly about survival. It's telling us get out of a dangerous situation. There's a wonderful book that came out a few years ago called The Gift of Fear. And the author was talking about that we need to pay attention to it because sometimes it's telling us that we are in a situation which might be dangerous. But our default when we're feeling anxious and the what ifs and this could happen, that could happen, is to want to get rid of it. Okay, it's unpleasant. We don't like it. We want to stop it, avoid it, distract from it. The problem is doing all that usually makes it worse. Okay. And so our challenge in terms of our path, in terms of this practice, is can we just simply be with it like any other experience? You've heard me say many times, if we get in a wrestling match with our anxiety, we're going to lose. I mean, that's generally true. If we get in a wrestling match with any of our negative experiences, we're generally going to lose. And often our non-specific anxiety, our so-called free-floating anxiety, is really tied into perfectionistic expectations or expectations for the ego, for the self, from which we feel we fall short. Okay. Think about, for instance, the most common of anxieties, which is public speaking anxiety, right? Usually it's, will I be judged? How am I going to do? Suppose I misspeak. Suppose I say something stupid. Suppose I blush and feel self-conscious. I mean, people can get really wound up, and I've been there, believe me, about public speaking anxiety. It's just a common one that most of us can relate to. Now, as I talk about in the chapter on anxiety in my book, human beings hate uncertainty. Okay, we just don't like it, and it often can generate a lot of anxiety for us. We want control. We want predictability. We want to know the future. We're constantly planning, thinking about, I should do this, I should do that. What if this? What if that? And some of it's very adaptive. I see that my fuel gauge is almost on empty. I get a little anxious because I'm looking for a gas station. I mean, that's appropriate. It's a warning. It's a very subtle warning signal to act and fill my tank up so I don't run out of gas on the interstate. But a lot of stuff that we get anxious about in terms of control in the future and predictability is stuff we have no control over. It's just kind of wasted adrenaline, wasted anxiety, you know. And we need to accept that we will never be anxiety free. It's just not going to happen, you know, unless we get a prefrontal lobotomy or something. I mean, our challenge is we have to change our relationship with it. And how do we do that? Well, in the simplest terms, and this is where our practice really informs us, we accept it rather than trying to escape from it. We accept it rather than trying to avoid it. We lean into it. We don't make anxiety the enemy. We see it as simply another experience that we have, an experience that will arise and pass away, that it is impermanent as any other experience, any other emotional or real life experience. And so for much of my life, I struggled with this. This was a challenge for me. I saw my anxiety as bad, as a weakness, as a failure, as a defect. I was ashamed of it. I was ashamed of being anxious. I tried to hide it. You know, anxiety about performance, about failure, about disappointing others, about being judged negatively, about anxiety about anxiety. I mean, it was present for much of my waking existence at a higher level than was certainly comfortable. It was exhausting. It was a source of tremendous suffering in my life. And it was only when through this practice I stopped fighting with it, I stopped wrestling with it, I stopped feeling defective because of it or ashamed of it, that my relationship with it changed. And lo and behold, when I accepted it and leaned into it, boom, it just dropped. It's sort of, I'm not saying I don't get anxious, but that constant kind of nagging, persistent anxiety, it just, once I stopped wrestling with it, it tended to just dissipate. It went away. And that has continued. And so my thing about anxiety, I said this as a psychologist, I say this as a Dharma teacher, is acceptance. You know, we have to lean into it. We have to say, anxiety is happening now. We don't identify with it. We don't say, I'm an anxious person. Because once I've defined myself as an anxious person, guess what? Self-fulfilling prophecy. If I say instead, oh, anxiety is happening now because X, Y, or Z, I see it for what it is, I recognize its impermanence, it really takes the potency out of it. It really takes the wind out of the sails of it, okay? Now, anxiety is not going to go away by doing that, but it's going to be decreased, it's going to be lessened, and our suffering is going to diminish because anxiety is not fun, okay? So my mantra now, whenever I'm in a situation, is anxiety's happening. Here it is, again, my old friend, welcome. Come in, as Rumi says, have a cup of tea. You know, I know you'll come and go. And this is a well-known strategy. I mean, it's not just unique to the Buddhist teaching of accepting all experience and leaning into all experience. It pops up in psychology. Joe sent me a link to this morning from the book Dune by Herbert, where one of the characters talks about accepting his anxiety. I mean, it's generally been well known over the millennia that this is the way to go. But our default is to push it away, run from it, avoid it, treat it as the enemy, and then it only worsens. So let me stop there and get your thoughts about dealing with this universal, pervasive human experience.